Hey folks, before we start with today's stories, remember to subscribe as it really helps the channel. The witching hour, commonly thought to occur at 3 a.m., is the time of night when anything is possible. It's believed that the veil between realities is thin at 3 a.m., and even if you disregard the superstition as dime store hokum, you can probably still admit strange things happen late into the night. Almost everyone has experienced something strange late at night, whether you're startled awake or already up. But these 3 a.m. encounters shared on Reddit are far beyond unexplained noises. They're absolutely terrifying. Whether it's a visit from beyond or a jarring earthly encounter, these stories will make you want to check your locks if you're reading them before you go to bed. When I was about 10 years old, my brother and I were home alone one night, while my parents went out for a few hours. We're both sitting in the living room relaxing, when all of a sudden, we hear a barely audible voice from down the hall. We both just looked at each other and froze, making sure we both heard it, but we were too scared to check it out. A couple minutes of silence went by, then suddenly, we heard it again. Only this time we heard it more clearly because we were paying more attention. It was a voice, but there was something weird about the way it sounded and we couldn't understand it, almost like it was speaking some kind of gibberish. My brother got up and stepped into the hallway. I reluctantly followed. "Hello?" he called out after a moment of listening for movement. Nothing. We carefully walked further down the hallway to where we heard it and looked around. No signs of anyone. We looked around a bit more and then started to walk back into the living room, when suddenly, we heard it again right behind us, making me jump. But we realized it didn't sound like a person talking inside the house. It was almost like it was coming out of a walkie-talkie or something, like when there aren't any low or high frequencies in a sound, just the static-y, distorted mids. And still, it was speaking in some weird language I couldn't place. We looked at each other, now more puzzled than scared, but my kid brain started coming up with all sorts of creepy explanations. Maybe there is someone in the house, but they left their walkie-talkie out somewhere, and an accomplice was communicating with them from outside, asking if we were alone, so they could come in and sack the place. We kept looking around the area and were completely stumped as to what was producing the sound. It happened again, and we realized it was coming from directly above where we were standing. We looked up and saw the fire alarm with a small, flashing red light. It was trying to tell us to change the battery, but the language was set to French. I was working graveyard shift alone. As I've done many nights before, I didn't get my break until very late in my shift because there had been an emergency. So I head out to the lobby where they have some more comfortable seats and start watching a little YouTube. I work 12-hour shifts, and it's not uncommon for me to take a nap. I'm feeling a little sleepy. That is, right up until I hear the elevator from around the corner ding and listen to the doors open. Suddenly wide awake, I sit there in silence until the doors close again. Was it a glitch with the elevator? There's no one else that works in the building at these hours. Just about the time I start to relax, the elevator does it again. This time, I can hear a faint voice. I can't see into the elevator from where I'm sitting, and I'm now straight up hoping that security is messing with me because I don't want to consider the alternatives. So I get up and walk over to the door. The elevator call button was malfunctioning and security thought I was stuck, so they were sending it to multiple floors and trying to talk over the intercom. My family was all asleep at 3 a.m. when I awoke to scratching at the front door. I peeked through the window to find a beaten, bloody, young woman sitting cross-legged on my front step staring back at me. It was my neighbor. Her left eye was swollen shut, and she had a laceration on her head. I opened the door and tried to get her to come inside. She was extremely drunk and hardly wearing anything on this winter, windy, rainy day. She was babbling and not making any sense. I called 911, but when she realized I was calling for help, she screamed and climbed over my chain-link fence, flopping onto the ground. She ran down the street, flailing her arms, screaming. I thought her boyfriend beat her up. They had known domestic issues. Come to find out, earlier that day she got rip-roaring drunk, then tripped and hit her head on concrete. The laceration on her head actually had stitches in it already, which I couldn't see in the dark. When she got home from the ER, she stole her roommate's whiskey and pounded most the bottle. Then she just went berserk. I fell asleep and woke up to the door being bashed in and doorbell being smashed. In my sleepiness, I thought it was my sister forgetting her key after taking the dog out. I didn't realize it was like 2 or 3 a.m. I got up when I thought nobody was getting up to let her in. I went down and opened the door. This barely dressed girl fell in on top of me. I grabbed her and shoved her out the door, out of the porch, and into the arms of a guy standing in our front garden. I blinked and looked at them, and the taxi still waiting outside. The girl was completely intoxicated, and the guy was so confused. I told him, "Wrong house," and he proceeded to drag the girl over the low garden wall. We had a small gate and they didn't seem to use it, and got into the taxi and left. To this day, my dad always brings it up. He thinks they were scoping out the place to rob us, and that was their cover to get someone to open the door. I was starting to fall asleep on my couch sometime after 2:30 a.m. when I heard a cell phone go off in my basement. It was one of those old Nokia ringtones. I live alone. I froze in place on couch and didn't really know what to do. I wondered if I had just imagined it, since I was in that half-awake, half-asleep state, but I'm sure I heard it. The next day, I went down there with a flashlight and my handgun to scope it out. The only reason I ever have to go into my basement is to relight the furnace. There is a door down there that leads outside to the street, and I live right next to a highway. The only thing I can think of is that someone snuck in through the door and left. My dog was going ballistic at our side door. I yelled for her to come to me, but she refused to leave it and kept barking, which was really unusual behavior for her. As I come down the steps, I see a big dude standing on the other side of the door, fiddling with the knob and trying to get in. My heart stopped. I asked what he wanted, and he paused and looked at me surprised, as though he hadn't realized I could see him. I wouldn't have been able to if I hadn't been on the steps. He said he was looking for somebody. I tried to sound hard and said I already called the cops. He called me a b-tatch and turned and ran off into the night. What scared me the most was he knew I was awake, and he knew the dog was in there, and he still tried to come in. That only tells me he had a plan for dealing with us, or was crazy enough to not care. When I was about 5 or 6, I woke up and saw an old woman standing in the doorway of my bedroom. She didn't say anything, just looked at me silently and stood there. But I was filled with the most horrible sense of dread I've ever felt in my life. I was absolutely terrified of this woman, and I hid under my covers and would peek out every few minutes to see if she was there. After what felt like hours, but was probably only like 15 minutes, she was gone when I looked. I ran into my parents' room crying, and my dad searched my room and the rest of the house but didn't find anyone. I slept with them for the rest of the night. I never did find a good explanation for what I saw, but a lot of other weird things happened in that house before we moved a few years later. Scariest thing I've ever seen to this day. At the time, I had a bedroom on the top floor of the house with a skylight right above my bed. I loved that skylight. You could see the stars and the moon and the occasional meteor. Anyway, one night around 3 a.m. I was awoken by the most hellish noise, and I could see through the window that trees outside were dancing in wind. Suddenly, a blinding light came through the skylight, and the whole room was filled with a bluish light. I had no idea what was going on. End of the world? Jesus coming to get me. Then I realized the hellish noise was a helicopter, and the light was one of those searchlights they use. I know those are common in cities, but I live in a rural area. The light clicked off, the helicopter flew away. The next morning, I hear from a sheriff's deputy that a man had broken into a house a mile or so away, had injured the homeowner, then had run off into the night, so they were searching the woods and nearby farms with the helicopter and light. It was December 2010. My cousin, who lives in San Francisco, had invited my younger brother and me to go and visit. He had just recently gotten married, and he wanted us to meet his new wife. So we decide to go. He pays the tickets, we pack up, and by sundown, we're all ready to leave the next morning. We fall asleep. Suddenly, I wake up. My dad is sitting at the foot of my bed, shaking me awake and calling my name. I'm thinking he's about to ask if we were ready to go. No. Apparently, a woman had knocked at the door that morning. She was wearing all black, and she looked, according to my father, very sketchy. It was about 3 a.m. when she knocked on the door and asked my father, "Does Tim live here?" Tim will be my name for the remainder of the story. So my dad just freaked out. How does she know my son? He wonders. He probes a bit further. How old is he? She gives him what was my exact age at the time. My dad freaks out a bit more. None of us know who this woman is, and here she is, spouting off information about me. Fine, then what's his last name? This apparently stumps her, and she takes out her phone to call someone. "Give me a moment," she says, walking away from the door. My dad just eyes her skeptically from afar. Suddenly, she gets back into her car and drives away without another word. What the fuck? So, my dad asked me if I knew who she was. I said I had no clue. He then began suspecting I had ordered some prostitute. I asked him why I would ever do a thing like that. I then suggested it was perhaps a prank from one of my friends, but I didn't have any friends that would do something like that. So here we have no idea who this woman is or why she knew my name. Keep in mind it is currently 4 a.m. Our flight leaves at 10 a.m. We wake my brother up, which was the dumbest mistake we ever made, and tell him the news. Somehow he gets scared. He was already nervous about flying to begin with. Now we have this mystery woman chasing us. He declines to fly that morning. My blood boils because I really wanted to go. I try with every effort on my part to try and convince my brother to still go. Then my dad chimes in and agrees that maybe we shouldn't go. He was paranoid that the lady was keeping an eye on us. I ask him, how are we important? What would she need us for? My dad leaves for work, and now I'm stuck trying to reconvince my brother to go. I didn't want to go without him. I call up my cousin and tell him the news. He tries his best to convince my brother to go anyway. No luck, so we end up not going. That Christmas, my family did nothing, all because someone was at the wrong place at the wrong time.